Here are 4 facts, all current, all documented before we go any further. Fact 1, your phone has a setting called 2G fallback. And on most phones sold today, including brand new 5G phones, it's turned on by default. You didn't turn it on. Nobody asked you. It came that way out of the box. Fact 2, 2G is the cellular protocol from 1991. It has no way to check whether a tower is real before connecting to it. None. A device pretending to be a tower can force your phone down to this protocol in seconds, and once you're there, your calls and texts can be intercepted directly. Fact 3, this isn't theoretical. Devices built specifically to do this are called MSI catchers, commonly sold and known under the brand name Stingray. They've been documented in active use for years. They've gotten cheaper, and researchers now confirm ordinary individuals with no government backing can obtain and run one. Fact 4, 3 separate organizations have already built real working defenses against this exact problem because it's serious enough that they spent years of engineering time on it. Google added a way to turn off 2GEE starting with Android 12 in 2021, then added active attack detection with the Mobile Network Security Suite in Android 16, released last year. Apple built cellular downgrade protection into lockdown mode starting with iOS 17. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation released a free open source detection tool called Ray Hunter that runs on a $20 to $30 device. Those 4 facts are the entire reason this video exists, and every single one of them checks out against public reporting from the organizations named. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly where this setting lives on your phone, exactly what turning it off does and doesn't protect you from, and exactly why researchers keep pointing to it as the single most effective thing an ordinary person can do about this specific threat. Then, I'll walk you through 4 more layers that reinforce it, including one hardware detail that currently decides whether your phone can actually alert you when this happens, or only block it silently without ever telling you. I want to be direct about something before we go further. I'm not here to convince you that every cell tower near you is hostile, because the overwhelming majority obviously aren't. What I am here to do is walk you through a well-documented, thoroughly studied vulnerability that Google, Apple, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation have each independently spent real engineering resources building specific defenses against. Organizations don't allocate years of development time to imaginary threats. If this gap weren't serious enough to matter, none of these protections would exist in the first place. It's worth being precise about how this compares to other cellular security gaps you may have heard referenced elsewhere, because the specificity matters. This isn't the same issue as SIM swapping, which requires a criminal to socially engineer your carrier directly. It isn't the same as SS7 network exploitation, which typically requires access to carrier-level signaling infrastructure that isn't available to an ordinary bad actor. The 2G downgrade vulnerability is meaningfully more accessible than both of those, because the equipment required has become commercially available, compact, and inexpensive enough that researchers describe it as within reach of individuals with no institutional backing whatsoever. Not just governments or well-resourced criminal organizations. That distinction is exactly why this specific setting deserves more attention than it currently gets, relative to how often it comes up in mainstream phone security advice. Now let's get into exactly how the attack works, in plain terms, because understanding it is what makes the fix make sense. Every phone connects automatically to whichever cell tower has the strongest signal nearby. That's not a flaw. That's simply how cellular networks have always worked, prioritizing a fast connection over almost anything else. The problem is one specific weakness in the oldest protocol still supported today, 2G. 2G never required a tower to prove it was real before your phone would connect to it. No verification, no check, nothing. Your phone just trusts it. Here's the attack, step by step. A fake tower, small enough to fit in a bag or a parked car, broadcasts a signal stronger than the real towers nearby. Your phone, following its normal behavior, tries to connect to it. The fake tower then sends what's called a reject message, a technical signal that interrupts your phone's routine background check-in with the network. That rejection forces your phone into a state where it believes 2G is the only option available. Once you're locked onto that weaker connection, the fake tower can pull your AMSI, the permanent ID number tied to your SIM card, pinpoint your location precisely, and in more advanced setups, intercept your actual calls and texts. All of this happens with zero visible warning on your screen. 5G was specifically designed to close part of this gap, and it's worth understanding exactly what it does and doesn't fix, because the nuance matters enormously here, and it's the exact nuance most headlines skip entirely. True standalone 5G networks introduced something called a subscription concealed identifier, which encrypts your permanent subscriber identity before it's ever transmitted during the initial handshake, specifically to prevent this exact kind of identifier harvesting. In theory, on a genuine standalone 5G network, IMSI catching becomes significantly harder. In practice, researchers have been direct about the gap between theory and deployment, and the gap is bigger than most 5G marketing ever admits. Most carriers, including the majority operating across the United States right now, are running non-standalone 5G, meaning the network handles actual authentication through the older 4G core infrastructure underneath, which reopens the exact vulnerability 5G was supposed to close. 5G, as currently deployed almost everywhere, is a partial improvement, not a solution, and researchers studying 5G's own attachment procedures have identified additional vulnerabilities that can still reveal a device's presence and enable tracking, even when the permanent identifier itself stays fully encrypted. Here's the setting, the one this entire video is built around. Both major mobile operating systems have quietly built in the ability to simply refuse 2G connections altogether, closing off the single technique that the overwhelming majority of real-world downgrade attacks depend on. Google first introduced this capability with Android 12, giving users the ability to disable 2G connectivity system-wide for the first time. On modern Android devices, open settings, then network and internet, then SIMs, or on some devices, simply search settings for 2G, and you'll find a toggle labeled Allow 2G. Turn it off. That's the entire step. No restart required, no advanced menu, just one tap. Once it's disabled, your phone will refuse to fall back to that protocol entirely, meaning the specific mechanism that makes the vast majority of real-world Stingray deployments work against ordinary people simply stops functioning against your device, full stop. On iPhone, Apple built the same underlying protection directly into lockdown mode, starting with iOS 17, which restricts your device's ability to fall back onto legacy cellular protocols as part of a broader hardening package. You'll find it under Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Lockdown Mode, and turning it on takes about 10 seconds once you know where to look. It's worth being direct about the trade-off here too. Lockdown mode is a genuinely aggressive setting that restricts a number of other features, specifically designed for high-risk users, journalists, activists, people who have real reason to expect they might be targeted. So weigh that context before switching it on as your daily driver, though the cellular protection specifically is something every phone owner should understand exists. If you're wondering whether disabling 2G will actually break anything for you day to day, for the overwhelming majority of people in the overwhelming majority of places, the honest, direct answer is no. You likely won't notice a single difference because most modern coverage in populated areas runs on 4G and 5G already. The only realistic downside shows up if you frequently travel to extremely rural areas or specific countries where 2G remains the only available signal, in which case you'd simply lose service entirely in that specific location until you turned it back on. For nearly everyone watching this video right now, that trade-off isn't close, because most active Stingray deployments depend specifically on forcing a downgrade to 2G. Turning it off alone defeats a large share of real-world attacks before anything else in this video even matters. Now for the layer above that setting, and this is genuinely one of the more interesting developments in phone security over the past year, because it involves actual hardware, not just software, and reflects a broader industry shift toward treating this specific vulnerability as a design priority rather than an edge case. Starting with Android 16, Google introduced something called the Mobile Network Security Suite, a set of features specifically built to detect, not just prevent, this exact kind of attack while it's happening. Instead of only blocking the downgrade, your phone can now actively notify you the moment a network requests your identifiers under conditions that don't match normal behavior, or the moment a tower attempts to force you onto a less secure encryption method than what you're already using. Here's the catch, and it's an important one worth understanding clearly before you go looking for it on your own device. This specific detection capability requires particular hardware, specifically a certain modem baseband capability, and right now, the Pixel 10 series is the primary consumer device confirmed to ship with what's required to actually run it. If you're on an older phone, or a device from a manufacturer that hasn't implemented this yet, you have the ability to block the downgrade attack itself using the 2G toggle, but you may not yet have the ability to be actively alerted the moment someone attempts one against you specifically. It's worth factoring into your next upgrade decision, because as more manufacturers roll this capability into their hardware over the coming year, it's likely to become one of the more meaningful differentiators in phone security that most buyers have never even heard to ask about. For people who want to go a layer deeper than what's built into their phone by default, independent detection tools now exist specifically for this purpose. The Electronic Frontier Foundation released an open-source tool called Ray Hunter, built to run on a cheap Orbic RC400L mobile hotspot device, currently available for roughly $20 to $30. It works by monitoring only the control traffic passing between that hotspot and nearby cell towers, deliberately never touching your actual calls, messages, or web traffic, and watching specifically for the tells that indicate a fake tower is nearby. an unexplained forced 2G downgrade in an area with otherwise strong modern coverage, or a tower requesting your identifiers under conditions that don't match normal network behavior. When something anomalous shows up, the device flags it directly, a green line for nothing detected, a red line for an anomaly worth investigating. It's not a perfect solution, and the researchers behind it are honest about that limitation themselves. Detection can flag something suspicious happening nearby, but it can't always definitively prove exactly what occurred afterward with full certainty. But for journalists, activists, or genuinely anyone who wants direct visibility into what's actually happening on the cellular layer around them, rather than simply trusting that their phone is handling it correctly in the background, it's a meaningful low-cost option that didn't meaningfully exist for consumers even a few years ago. I want to address the elephant in the room directly, because it comes up in nearly every conversation about this topic, and dodging it would be dishonest. IMSI catchers have historically been deployed primarily by law enforcement and government agencies, frequently with minimal legal oversight or public transparency about when and where they're being used, which is a serious and legitimate concern entirely on its own, separate from the criminal misuse angle. But that landscape has been shifting, and it's shifted faster than most public awareness has caught up to. These devices, once expensive and difficult to obtain, have become significantly cheaper and more accessible over the past several years, and researchers monitoring the space have been explicit that it's now considerably easier for individuals without any legal authority whatsoever to acquire and deploy them for straightforward criminal purposes. Identity theft, targeted surveillance of a specific person, or harvesting call and text content from anyone unlucky enough to be nearby when the device is active. The protections we've just walked through don't distinguish between who's running the fake tower. They close the same technical vulnerability, regardless of whether it's a government agency, a criminal, or someone testing equipment they bought secondhand without fully understanding what they were doing. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because vague danger is easy to dismiss and specific documentation is not. The Electronic Frontier Foundation didn't build Ray Hunter as a theoretical exercise. They built it because independent researchers and journalists kept reporting anomalous, downgrade behavior in specific cities with no plausible innocent explanation, and there was previously no accessible, affordable way for an ordinary person to actually verify what they were experiencing rather than simply wondering about it. Law enforcement use of cell site simulators in the United States has been documented across dozens of agencies at the federal, state, and local level, frequently under non-disclosure agreements with the manufacturer that historically prevented even judges and defense attorneys from being told the technology was used in a specific case at all, a practice that's been the subject of ongoing legal challenges, specifically because of how directly it undermines transparency in the justice system. None of that requires you to take a position on law enforcement policy to understand the core technical point relevant here. If this technology is common enough, well-funded enough, and controversial enough to have generated years of litigation, congressional hearings, and dedicated open-source detection projects, it is not a fringe concern invented for a video title. Here's a comparison that puts the current moment into perspective. 2G, the protocol underpinning the vast majority of active downgrade attacks, first launched commercially in the early 1990s. It predates modern smartphones by well over a decade. It predates modern encryption standards almost entirely. It was designed in an era when the primary security concern was preventing casual eavesdropping on analog radio, not defending against a purpose-built device engineered specifically to impersonate an entire cellular network. And yet, because of the sheer scale and inertia of global telecommunications infrastructure, actual complete 2GEE decommissioning is still years away in most of the world, and in large parts of the world isn't realistically planned within the next decade at all. That means a vulnerability originally built into a protocol designed before most of the people watching this video were even using cell phones is still, right now, in 2026, one of the most reliable tools available to anyone wanting to intercept a stranger's calls and texts without their knowledge. The fix isn't waiting for that infrastructure to finally catch up globally, because for most people, that wait could easily stretch another decade. The fix is the toggle sitting in your settings menu right now, which accomplishes on your individual device today what the broader industry transition won't finish for years. Let's talk about the second layer, because it addresses something the 2G toggle alone doesn't fully solve. Even on 4G LTE, where mutual authentication and stronger encryption genuinely do make content interception significantly harder than on 2G, your permanent identifier can still, in specific conditions, be extracted. Researchers have demonstrated that 4G IMSI catchers can reliably collect identifying information even without exploiting the 2G authentication weakness at all by triggering what's called a reattachment procedure and capturing the identifier during that initial exchange. This is a narrower, less dangerous exposure than full content interception, but it still allows for precise location tracking and confirms your presence in a specific area at a specific time, which on its own can be sensitive information depending on who you are and what you're doing. There isn't currently a simple universal toggle that closes this specific 4G gap the way the 2G toggle closes the more severe downgrade attack, which is exactly why standalone 5G, with its identifier encryption, matters so much for the future of this problem, and why the transition away from non-standalone deployments among carriers is worth paying close attention to as it continues rolling out region by region over the next several years, rather than something to simply assume is already finished everywhere. Third, and this is a habit rather than a toggle, one that costs nothing and requires no technical knowledge to apply consistently, pay attention to unusual battery drain and unexplained signal behavior, specifically a phone that repeatedly and inexplicably drops from 4G or 5G down to a weaker connection type in locations where you'd normally expect strong modern coverage. This isn't a definitive sign on its own. Plenty of ordinary network congestion or infrastructure issues can cause the exact same symptom. But security researchers who study this space consistently point to unexplained downgrade behavior as one of the most reliable observable indicators available to an ordinary user without any specialized detection hardware at all. If you notice your phone repeatedly showing a 2G or 3G indicator in a location where you've always previously had strong 4G or 5G service, and there's no obvious explanation like a known local outage, it's worth treating that as a signal worth paying attention to rather than dismissing automatically. Fourth, if you're someone who has a specific, elevated reason to be concerned about targeted surveillance, a journalist working with sensitive sources, someone in an abusive relationship situation, an activist, or anyone handling information that a determined and resourced adversary might specifically want, consider using lockdown mode as your default operating state rather than only for testing, despite the real convenience trade-offs it introduces elsewhere on your device. For the average person going about an ordinary day, the 2G toggle alone captures the overwhelming majority of the realistic risk without the broader restrictions lockdown mode introduces. But risk isn't the same for everyone reading this, and it's worth being honest that some of you watching this have a genuinely different threat calculation than most, and should weigh these tools accordingly rather than assuming the average recommendation is automatically the right one for your specific situation. It's worth spending a moment on what a realistic worst case actually looks like here, not to frighten you, but because concrete scenarios make abstract settings feel worth actually changing instead of something to get to later. Picture a person walking through a dense downtown area, a protest, a courthouse, a conference, anywhere. A lot of specific people are gathered in a predictable location at a predictable time. A device the size of a briefcase, placed in a parked car or carried in a backpack, begins broadcasting as the strongest available signal in that immediate area. Every phone within range that hasn't disabled 2GE connectivity automatically and silently attempts to connect, exactly the way phones are designed to behave around any strong signal. For the operator, this isn't about targeting one specific person with surgical precision. It's about harvesting identifiers and location data from an entire crowd simultaneously, then sorting through that haul afterward to identify who was actually present. Nobody in that crowd sees anything unusual happen. No app crashes, no warning message appears. Their phone simply, briefly, quietly connects to something it shouldn't have, and by the time anyone leaves the area, whatever data was going to be collected already has been. Now picture the same scenario with 2GE disabled across every phone in that crowd. The fake tower can still attempt to broadcast, but it can no longer force the specific downgrade its entire operation depends on for the majority of its capability. Phones running 4G or 5G LTE with 2G refused simply won't connect to a downgrade attempt in the first place. The device either has to rely on far weaker 4G only techniques, which are considerably harder to execute reliably and yield far less, or its operation in that specific location effectively fails. That's the entire practical difference this one setting makes. Not a guarantee of total invulnerability. Nothing in security ever offers that. But a meaningful, documented reduction in what an entire class of cheap, widely available surveillance equipment can actually accomplish against you specifically, achieved through a single toggle that costs you nothing in most locations and takes less time to activate than it took to read this paragraph. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, because it shows up across nearly every phone security topic once you start looking closely, and this one is no exception, regardless of which manufacturer or operating system you personally prefer. The vulnerability we've spent this entire video walking through isn't a bug that a future software update will simply patch away one day. It's a structural consequence of a decision made decades ago, prioritizing backward compatibility and seamless global roaming over requiring every tower to prove its legitimacy before a phone trusts it. That decision made enormous sense in the era it was made, when the primary concern was simply getting phones to work reliably as people traveled between countries and carriers. It has aged into a liability precisely because the tools capable of exploiting that trust have become dramatically cheaper and more accessible than anyone building these standards ever anticipated. This is exactly why the fix, in the near term, sits with you in the toggle in your own settings menu, rather than with some future protocol update that will eventually make the entire conversation obsolete. That update is coming, eventually, as standalone 5G deployment expands and as 2G infrastructure is gradually retired region by region over the coming decade. Until then, the setting you have direct control over today is the one actually protecting you. I also want to be honest about a common point of confusion, because getting this wrong leads people to either overreact or underreact in ways that don't serve them well. Disabling 2G does not make you invisible to cellular networks entirely, and it was never meant to. Your phone still connects to 4G and 5G towers exactly as normal, and legitimate carriers can still see your general location the same way they always have, because that's a fundamental requirement of how any cellular network delivers calls and texts to you at all. What disabling 2G actually does is remove your phone's willingness to fall back to the one specific legacy protocol that lacks tower authentication and modern encryption, closing the door that virtually all documented downgrade attacks walk through, without changing your phone's normal everyday relationship with the legitimate network you actually pay for service through. It's a targeted fix for a specific, well-documented gap, not a blanket cloak of invisibility, and understanding that distinction matters if you want to actually explain this setting accurately to someone else, instead of accidentally spreading a slightly exaggerated version of it. One last thing worth checking while you're in this list: apps you no longer use but which still run in the background, syncing or checking for updates, even though you've forgotten they exist. These don't just cost storage, they cost battery and data too, compounding the original problem. If an app hasn't been opened in 6 months, it's very unlikely you're going to suddenly need it this week. Delete it and treat the ease of reinstalling as your safety net, rather than leaving it installed indefinitely just in case. Let's bring all 5 together clearly so you can actually act on this. 1. Clear the cache on your 3 or 4 heaviest daily apps, reclaiming multiple gigabytes in under 2 minutes with zero risk. 2. Run the duplicate photo finder, clear old screenshots, and empty recently deleted, since full resolution photos and burst shots quietly consume more than almost anything else. 3. Check your Files app and browser downloads, sorted by size, since there's very likely at least one forgotten file that's been dead weight for a year or more. 4. Turn off automatic media and voice message downloads in your messaging apps, since that setting silently hoards other people's content onto your device. 5. Sort your app list by size and delete anything you haven't opened in 6 months, since a single forgotten app can outweigh every cache and download folder combined. Remember the context underneath all of this. As on-device AI keeps expanding, 40 to 60 gigabytes of your storage is now permanently reserved before you've even started. You're not just fighting your own accumulated clutter anymore, you're fighting a shrinking baseline, which makes every gigabyte you reclaim through these 5 settings worth more today than it would have been 2 years ago. None of these 5 fixes require a new phone, a paid cloud plan, or a third-party cleaner app that promises to optimize your device, and usually does very little. Every fix is already built into the phone you own, free and available, the moment you finish this video. If this helped you reclaim space you didn't know you'd lost, send it to the person in your life who's constantly complaining. Their phone says storage full. They almost certainly have no idea any of these 5 settings exist, the same way you probably didn't a few minutes ago. Here's the bigger pattern worth remembering long after today's cleanup. Storage problems are never about one guilty file. They're about accumulation, small amounts of forgotten data compounding quietly month after month until the total is impossible to ignore. Manufacturers aren't hiding these settings out of malice most of the time. They bury them because a clean, simple interface is what makes phones easy to use for people who don't want to think about file systems. But easy to use and easy to maintain aren't the same thing. The gap between them is exactly where 2 to 5 gigabytes disappears every month. Exactly where 40 to 60 gigabytes gets reserved for AI you may barely interact with, and exactly where a phone that felt roomy on day 1 starts rejecting your own photos 2 years later. The fix was never complicated. 5 specific places to look, 5 specific things to clear. Roughly 10 minutes today, repeated every few months going forward. That's the entire method, not a hidden file threatening to wipe your device, not some sinister system working against you, just an ordinary, predictable pattern of digital clutter nobody ever explained in plain language until now. Make it a habit, not a one-time fix, because the reason this sneaks up on people is that it's invisible until it isn't. Pick one day a month, the first of the month, payday, whatever's easy to remember, and spend 5 minutes running the same checklist. Clear cache on your top few apps. Glance through your camera roll for anything disposable, check your downloads folder for anything new that snuck in, and glance at your app list sorted by size for anything you haven't opened lately. 5 minutes? Once a month? And you'll never again hit a storage full warning that feels like it came from nowhere because you'll have caught it early, every time, instead of discovering it all at once years later. None of this is your fault, and none of it happened because you did something wrong. These defaults, auto-downloading media, uncapped cache growth, forgotten installs sitting untouched, were set by manufacturers and developers serving their own goals first: a faster-feeling app, an instantly loading chat, a frictionless install. Your storage was simply where the cost of those decisions landed, quietly, without anyone explaining the trade-off. You're not cleaning up a mess you made. You're finally seeing a mess that was made on your behalf years ago, and now you have the full picture and the exact steps to fix it permanently, starting today. That's really the whole point of walking through the data at the start of this video. Not to alarm you, but to show you that this pattern is real, current, measurable, and most importantly, entirely within your control to reverse in the next 10 minutes. So do it now, 10 minutes, 5 settings before you close this and forget every one of them by tomorrow. Your phone will run better tonight than it has in months. Apps will open faster. Photos will save instantly instead of hanging. And the storage full warning that's been quietly haunting you finally has a real permanent answer, one you now fully understand and fully control. 3 numbers got you into this. 40 to 60 gigabytes reserved before you start, 2 to 5 gigabytes lost every month, 80 to 90% higher memory prices this year alone. 5 settings get you back out: cache, photos, downloads, auto media, and forgotten apps. 10 minutes today, 5 minutes a month after that. That's the whole method, start to finish, and it works on the phone already sitting in your hand right now. Go clear it.